Hello everyone, and welcome to this Christmas special of the Edtech podcast. In the spirit of good cheer, we have a giveaway this week. Past guest and listener Richard Taylor has a couple of 100 nanoseconds, which could be a great addition to a science fair, classroom or board meeting to get minds whirring. What's a nanosecond, I hear you ask? Well, listen back to episode 53 with Richard Taylor and you'll find out. Or Richard's email summarises as the following. These are fancy cloth-coated bits of wire, the same length as it takes light to travel in a nanosecond. The idea is a copy of what Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, my Edtech hero, used to demonstrate to US Defence Department officials why she needed the funding for her projects. Science tech teachers used to love them, but these were made and donated by a very cool UK company who make custom lights and such. So, if you want those nanoseconds plus a bag of retro EdTech event t-shirts for your team, class or otherwise, please email in at theedtechpodcast@gmail.com and we'll get those posted out to you. And thank you and shout out to Richard for thinking of us. What's next? This week's episode is in conversation with Vikas Pota, man of myriad talents, including leading the Global Education Skills Forum, the Next Billion Prize and now Tmrw Digital. To break all those parts down and to find out what they mean for education and EdTech, let's kick off. P.S. Keep your ears open in this episode for the invitation for our listeners to join the forum and how. Here's Vikas explaining the GESF event.
The Global Education Skills Forum next year is from the 22nd to the 24th of March. And we're asking a central question, which is, who is changing the world? The reason we ask this is because the traditional ways in which change occurs is changing massively. And so it used to be the case that, the head of state or a government effects change. Actually, we see so much change happening from all over the place. So what we want to do is actually bring in some of these change makers who may be in different sectors to come and speak about their own personal journeys, tell us about what strategies and what tactics they're deploying so that those of us in the education sector can perhaps learn and understand as to how we do the same in education. There's long been a discussion around, and I'm sure we're all fed up about the school of the future and how we disrupt education. Actually, what we ought to do is understand how others have done it in their own sectors and think about, well, how do we effect that change? And as educators, as policymakers, as investors, as entrepreneurs, we would do well in listening to how other people have approached it. So, for example, we have some prolific people who, in the environmental conservation space, climate change space, who have effected massive change coming. We have people from the tech sector who have effected massive change. And when you think about how they've achieved it, and when you hear their stories, I think it inspires a greater conversation. But at GESF this year, or next year rather, like this year, we have a really great EdTech strand of programming where you not only have the Next Billion EdTech Prize, but you also have great content by way of panels, discussions, workshops that bring together the world and some of the most incredible innovators together to address the challenges that I speak about. And I think that's going to be a fantastic output from the conference. So anyone who wishes to join us who's listening to your podcast would be most welcome if they can go onto the website, which is www.educationandskillsforum.org, and fill in a form and say that you heard this podcast, and I'll make sure that they're admitted to the conference.
As Vikas explained, part of the GESF is the Next Billion Prize. I found the entrance extremely high quality when I listened in to the prize pitches in March in Dubai. In this episode, you'll hear how UK EdTech and language company Chatterbox won the prize and why. But before all that, I had the chance to catch up with TechCrunch editor Mike Butcher at the end of this year's session to work through the nominees. So I'm absolutely delighted to finally be here with Mike Butcher from TechCrunch. Welcome.
Hello.
So Mike, you've been essentially sort of moderating and judging the Next Billion at the Global Education Skills Forum. So can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen over the last couple of days and how that fits into the wider tech sector that you have a great view of?
Thanks. Well, yes, we saw about 42 companies pitch, everything ranging from people literally putting in physical centers in Pakistan to all the way up to, mentors from, the biggest universities mentoring people from emerging markets. And I guess a couple of my takeaways so far have been that, it's been fascinating to see EdTech a little bit develop away from some of the very kind of rote or rather unimaginative takes on what it could do a few years ago to being a lot more creative. There's a lot of early stage companies who are really honing in on some specific issues, and it's partly to do with the fact that people came around to the idea of much more user-centered design and getting some better data out of some of the projects that they were doing. And you can sort of see it coming through in the market now. And it's an area that I wasn't particularly keeping an eye on a couple of years ago, but to be brutally honest, nothing really seemed to have the wow factor. But it's really, really fascinating and instructive to delve back into it and to see some new entrepreneurs come through the system, in the ecosystem, and start to get a lot more creative, I think.
So we've got our 6 finalists for this as well. You won't be able to skew the award finalists because this won't go out until afterwards. But
sure.
Are there any there that particularly captured your imagination as well?
Yeah, well, we had 6 finalists at this competition: BizNation, Chatterbox, Dotlearn, Localized, Learning Machine, and Teach Me Now. And just to speak to them, I suppose, BizNation, 3 young women founders from Latin America, from Colombia, scaling an education platform that aimed very much at millennials, but also aimed at sort of really energizing the idea of entrepreneurship, coming on your own entrepreneur skills in that sense, kind of like a mini MBA almost, like that you would actually turn into an entrepreneur if you used BizNation. And they've really proved the model very well in Latin America and in Colombia. And it's the sort of thing you can see growing internationally if they...
And a bit cheaper than an MBA.
And a bit cheaper than an MBA. And probably a little bit more worthwhile to some extent. And then there was Chatterbox, which has got a fascinating story, has helped refugees scale the ability to teach languages, to teach Arabic, for instance, but also a scalable platform to teach literally the world every other language apart from, your normal French, English, German, Chinese, but every other language. And that's absolutely fascinating, especially for emerging markets, which was the big theme of this whole competition.
I've seen a couple of startups in that space. One that was dedicated to this resurgence of learning, I suppose, languages that are going out of fashion. So whether it's Welsh or others, and serving that market, as you just discussed. Yeah. And also, we've had on the podcast before the lack of Arabic language teachers, and I know there was another startup that was looking at that as well.
Yeah, Sejal was actually aimed at aggregating Arabic content. That was one of the companies that pitched. Very interesting company. And absolutely, and what's interesting about it is also monetizing the ability to do it even in tiny niches, and that's super, super crucial, but fabulously scalable. And then there was Dotlearn, which has got a great backstory of one of the co-founders coming from sub-Saharan Africa, learning online, teaching himself to code, and then literally becoming a co-founder in a new company called Dotlearn that was united with an MIT graduate. So literally the emerging world meeting the developed world, and actually coming up with what I love to call the Pied Piper pitch, which is being able to shrink the size of learning videos and educational videos to such a small size that it's much more palatable and cheaper to access in emerging markets, which is absolutely crucial. Lots of this sort of speaks to the problem that was happening a few years ago, which was, everyone was expecting to go onto YouTube and download these 100 megabyte gigabyte videos and learn from that. It's extremely expensive, especially in emerging markets. And I think this is such a good idea. Dotlearn has definitely come up with a really fascinating proposition.
It's very interesting because you are getting more edtech startups now that are,
providing content or doing things on legacy handsets and that kind of thing. Schuler's getting a lot of press at the moment in terms of personalised learning on a legacy handset. So
snackable content is a big educational technology trend. It's happening in the kind of what you might call mainstream, the startup space as well. So it's cool to see that happen in this space. Localized is a company which is effectively using the Trojan horse of universities to link up university students with mentors in developed markets, and kind of like the diaspora meets the people back home, shall we say. So you're potentially a young global leader in your emerging markets. You want to know how somebody else got out there and became like the president in the US, or I don't know, whatever else.
Data scientists they were talking about, weren't they? And you wouldn't necessarily say that.
And you want to learn how someone became successful in, say, the US or Europe or Asia or whatever. And you want to learn that, and you want to learn it from them.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. But this is also a model which is now kind of much more proven. There was many people launching mentoring platforms many years ago, and a lot of those failed because they were one-to-one. Now this is one-to-many. So literally you could sit in front of an incredible chief executive or a credible academic or a credible leader in their space and be mentored by them back in their home country, shall we say. So that's a fascinating company. Learning Machine. And now here we go. Now this is all blockchain. So
that's your sweet spot.
Blockchain is a fascinating new area, and it's a huge amounts of hype around blockchain. One of the reasons is that it might well lead to a serverless internet. You could literally run a massive application like Instagram on a blockchain, and it could scale to billions of users and not require any servers. And that's the promise of blockchain. Now, one of the also big, huge strengths of it is being able to register immutable data and documentation. And Learning Machine have come up with a fantastic way of registering and putting on the blockchain educational documents. And they've signed all deals already with countries like Malta. And it's an incredibly good idea because you are, for instance, you're a refugee and you were a professor in a university, and now you can't prove who you are and where you got your degree because you've lost all your documents. Or, you're in an emerging market and you can't prove that the university your document is difficult to prove because the university is hard to reach or whatever. This puts educational documents on the blockchain and for all time, and therefore will allow people who don't have access to that kind of scrutiny. In developed worlds, it's easy, just call up Oxford or Cambridge or whatever, and did this person get that degree? Well, Learning Machine will do that for the rest of the world, and that's a really fascinating project. And finally, Teach Me Now. This is kind of like Uber for teachers, in the sense that not that I call Teach Me Now and a teacher turns up, but in the sense that it's the gig economy, but scaled to education. So on Teach Me Now, you can say, listen, I know Swazi, right? I'm sitting in Swazi, and does somebody want to learn Swazi? Okay, pay me. I'll go on to Teach Me Now. I'll build a curriculum. I'll do videos. I'll build source material, all of that stuff, and then I'll set myself up and I'll teach you Swazi from Swaziland. Hurrah! And now, even though that's a kind of maybe an extreme use case, the point is that anybody on the planet can sit down at Teach Me Now, build a curriculum, become a teacher. Lots of people have tried this before. They've created marketplaces for teachers and, do a Skype call with me and I'll teach you something, or teach you some mathematics, or pay me over PayPal or whatever. But all of that was unstructured. It was, very informal, and it didn't really scale as a real project. Teach Me Now have come up with a very scalable solution. They've built the real fabulous tools that teachers really need to build curricula and to do real interaction with students on any subject. And it's really fascinating. Got a lot of potential, Teach Me Now. So those are the 6 that we picked as finalists.
Your memory is impeccable, may I say. Very impressive. And then if people obviously you're here. If people want to find out more, you're on Twitter, obviously, at Mike Butcher.
You can at Mike Butcher me, if you like.
Fantastic. And, we'll hopefully see more EdTech content even on TechCrunch coming up.
Yeah, sure. And you need to check out those companies. I think, and 3 of those, by the way, will go on to win the prize, which I'm sure by the time this podcast is out, you'll know who they are.
Yeah.
But all of them are very strong, and it was quite tough to boil that down from 42 companies, but all of them are extremely strong, and actually there was a very strong field entirely. So I think it's been great also to this conference and the Varkey Foundation to really go deep into this sector, because I think there is clearly a sort of a rejuvenation going on in the edtech market.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks again, Mike. I really enjoyed our conversation. Now it's time for my extended chat with Vikas about Tmrw Digital, his new EdTech-focused venture. But before all that, a huge thank you to you, the listeners, for your support in 2018. It's been a challenging year, but through it all, we've had many more episodes, plus insightful trips to Finland and China, a new podcast festival, and a couple more series thrown in. I also managed to cycle across France through the mountains and raise over £17,000 as a collective for 3 important charities. So thank you for letting me off to do that. To anyone who has listened, sponsored, shared or commented in 2018, thank you. And we've got some exciting projects and plans on the go for 2019, and I hope to be able to reveal some of those to you soon. Wherever you're listening in, Merry Christmas from here in the UK. Bye-bye. Okay, brilliant. Well, I'm delighted to have Vikas Pota, the Group Chief Executive for Tmrw Digital, on the line. So, hi, Vikas.
Hi, Sophie. Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you on the show finally. I know we've met before, and in the meantime, sort of Tmrw Digital has really come to life. So it's fantastic to finally get this chance to understand a little bit about what you're up to, and that going into 2019. For those people listening, they'll probably be familiar with you as the kind of face of the Global Teacher Prize and the Global Education Skills Forum, obviously with Sunny Varkey. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your new role at Tmrw Digital, what it is and how people might also be able to get involved.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast, which I listen to regularly. And some of the speakers that you have, some of the podcasts that you do, have been pretty important in my learning journey as well. So thank you for that. Prior to telling you what my future role is, maybe I should just tell you a little bit about what I've learned in the past decade or so since I've been in education. So you rightly point out that I used to run something called the Varkey Foundation, which is a family foundation focused on education and in particular on uplifting the status of teachers. And through that, we have a number of different things that we've done. One of the successes that we've had is the Global Teacher Prize, where we award $1 million to a teacher every year. And this year, there's a great London-based teacher called Andrea Zafirikou that won the prize, an art teacher. But we've had she has 3 predecessors. And so through the prize and through our engagement with the teaching community, what you learn is a number of things. But primarily, what I find is when I go to education conferences, when I go to education policy discussions, you will have all kinds of people there apart from teachers, which seems quite odd, actually. And so when I think about that, and I think about the status of teachers in particular, I think a much better job needs to be done in terms of telling people the story about how teachers are central to any of these education ambitions and goals that we have. And in that context, as a foundation head, what I used to do was having to engage with multilaterals, large international NGOs, the UN system, and what you find is the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is around quality education. And that today says we have over 260 million children still out of school, and that we need, to achieve SDG number 4, we need 69 million new teachers. The thing that I started thinking about was, well, how are we going to achieve that, given that in many parts of the world, including the UK, there's a retention and a recruitment crisis of teachers. How do we achieve this? And implicitly, I think we all know that technology has a role to play in bridging that, or bridging some of that at least. But what I found was in that world of, in the social sector, as it were, people weren't used to thinking about technology in any kind of strategic or structured way. They didn't have the vocabulary, they didn't have the language. And actually, when they thought about technology, they thought about the big brand names that exist. Where there's so much innovation that's taking place, and it struck me to be really odd that none of this none of these innovators or people who are doing incredible things were ever invited to the discourse. And that's what actually precipitated this move into the private sector and looking to unify all of Sunny Valki's EdTech investments and putting a strategy around them to say, okay, we have a role to play, to contribute to, of course, driving business, but obviously there's a bigger, higher purpose that we should be aiming for. And that doesn't differ whether you're running a foundation, whether you're running an EdTech company, or you're in a school. We want all children to be learning well and receiving a higher standard of education. So that's roughly what I've learned in the last 10 years. And I'm very excited about what happens in the future.
If I understand correctly as well, the last kind of 6 to 9 months has really been sort of you in sort of research mode, so traveling around the world, speaking to those innovators that you described and some of the sort of supporting structures around them, around EdTech. And I know that you have the chance to speak to lots of powerful people in powerful places, whether that's in the US or in India or wherever it might be. I wondered, out of some of those conversations, whether there are perhaps well-known figureheads that you've had conversations with about education or EdTech that perhaps have been surprising or has given some insight into their opinions on education and EdTech.
Yeah, so really great question. So when I told everyone that I was making this move, what I didn't expect was actually the flurry of emails saying, "Oh, we're interested in this discussion," because they'd never ever spoken to me about tech, through either their international NGOs, like I said, or through the UN discourse or any of the previous work that I'd done. So I was astounded. So whether you're a large foundation, whether you're a multilateral financing institution, they all seem to be interested in EdTech, as it were. Which took me by surprise. I mean, recently you'll have seen some work by the World Bank on this subject. There are international NGOs which, like Plan Canada and like the Malala Fund, who are interested in learning technologies. And I didn't realize that there'd be such an appetite for this discussion. So that was really welcoming and gave me a lot of encouragement. The thing that I've learned, more so than speaking to senior people or influential people or those with a brand, actually I've spent a lot of time speaking to startup entrepreneurs. Just try to understand, firstly, their language, how they think about things. And the thing that actually struck me was how there seems to be an aversion to thinking about education efficacy and education research. And I know in London we are blessed that we have an institution like the IOE that has this Educate program. But generally speaking, when you speak to startups around the world, when you say to them, what proof do you have of whatever you do working and actually achieving learning gains, they come unstuck. And I would say 9 out of 10 entrepreneurs I've spoken to, actually fall away there and then. I understand the challenges of when you're a startup and the costs involved in setting up various processes and thinking about things in a different way to make sure you capture, data around learning gains. But the reality is that we need people to start thinking from the get-go about how they bake in an approach that actually demonstrates that what works beyond just the anecdotes of a teacher or of a school or of a student that can give us confidence in how they're approaching whatever they're doing. So that's been a really big learning curve for me.
It's interesting that you say that about efficacy, because I think, as you mentioned, perhaps in London it's sort of a given, whereas when you travel around the world, the conversation seems to be earlier on in terms of thinking about efficacy. I mean, listening to you talk about that, does that suggest that this is a solution or some kind of product that Tmrw Digital might help solve in terms of discoverability of EdTech products that have that efficacy baked in?
Sure. So one of the things that I did was we set up something called the Tmrw Institute, which looks at how the public benefit argument of learning technologies. So it's organizing many conferences, and in March we have the Global Education and Skills Forum, where Tmrw Institute is running the EdTech side of things, and through these mechanisms that are at our disposal, we want to use that to shine a spotlight on what good looks like. And that's why we have, for example, the Next Billion Edtech Prize that looks at exactly what I said, but in the developing economies where there's so much activity, whether it's India, Nigeria, Argentina. There's a lot of great edtech entrepreneurs who are doing fascinating things. But the institute as a whole, we're in startup phase ourselves, and what we will do is commission research, we will convene, and we will try to make sure that we enlarge the discussion regarding what good edtech should look like.
And one of those events you had recently was looking at personalised learning, and had some very impressive researchers along. I wondered if you could share with our listeners a bit about what some of those researchers are working on and what kind of questions they're pondering when we think about how adaptive or personalised learning might develop.
Sure. So like you said earlier, that in the last 6 months, what I've done is, because I don't come from a tech background or a finance background, what I've done is I've gone around the world and spoken to friends and new peers and colleagues, whether they're in the investing world, whether they're in academia, whether they're in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, to understand how we should be thinking about edtech. There's a great professor actually at Harvard, John Kim, who actually uses a great framework to explain what the benefits of edtech are. So he describes it as, edtech is primarily used for three reasons. One is to do with productivity in a school or in a classroom. So you have lots and lots of edtech companies looking at that particular challenge. The second one is to do with online learning, which we instinctively understand because that's the world we live in now. And the third one is around personalization, and that's where you see the true benefits of edtech, where you can personalize education towards every child, and your listeners will understand what personalization is. So we decided to convene a group of, I would say, just under 50 people from around the world, including government ministers. So we had ministers from South Africa and from Ghana. We had academics from Stanford, Harvard, Carnegie Mellon, Pennsylvania University, and elsewhere. And then we had a group of startup entrepreneurs and researchers who were working in the field of personalized learning. What I found quite fascinating were two discussions. One was, what is the definition of personalization and how you think about that? And the other one was around the ethics of AI and personalization. And I think those two, just to convene this diverse group of people in a room to have discussions like that, I think adds to the body of knowledge that exists. I don't think we get a conclusion, but then I think it takes a great effort in arriving at a conclusion. Mm-hmm. So this is the start of a journey that will hopefully get us somewhere that we understand a lot better what the actual true potential of personalization is and how we should be thinking about that when it comes to policy, when it comes to funding, when it comes to building technology. I think that's a really good aim and goal for the Tmrw Institute.
It's really interesting when you mentioned the geographies present at the event as well. I read a recent article where you mentioned your passion for, Europe being the potential powerhouse of edtech versus perhaps like the US and China. And then, having attended the Next Billion Prize this year in Dubai, it was really refreshing to see that most of the entrants were representative of solving educational problems in emerging economies. So I wondered what, given that those two, the comment about Europe and then the kind of support for edtech in emerging economies, how you see the two playing out, and what we would expect to see at the Next Billion Prize in March as well.
Yeah, I'm interested in many parts of the world, so it's natural for me to deviate my attention towards other places apart from just London and the UK where I live. I think there's a huge amount of innovation that comes from Africa, as an example. Mm-hmm. If you look at India and what's happened in the Indian technological infrastructure play, I think it's been phenomenal that so many people are now using digital services. And we hear at the conference that I organized, you will hear of, we heard stories about how that has happened and what affected that transition and what the success of it has been. And so I think people can take inspiration from these countries which have opportunities to leapfrog more effectively than places like here, that perhaps have so many legacy systems and ways of doing things. And I think that's really interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually found it, very refreshing to see a different range of edtech companies and how they're approaching things. But also, it is really solving a problem. Whereas sometimes here it feels like you're kind of tweaking bits and bobs. But ultimately, we're obviously very, very lucky to have the educational system that we do. Albeit it can always be improved. Obvious question: what was your own schooling like?
I went to a local state comprehensive school in northwest London, and I had a most fabulous time in terms of I enjoyed the environment, I liked my teachers, I had a great peer group. Was I academic? Probably no. And my mother would say that is reflected in my grades. Not surprised. But to be honest, I think the move that we are seeing now, where if you read Yuval Harari's book, whether it's *Sapiens* or any of these, you'll understand that longevity of our lifespans is something that's happening. We may come to live to 100, 200, 130 years almost, and in that kind of time frame, the way that that education is provided to us will have to change. There's been a long discussion around lifelong learning, and just imagine if you live to 130, and actually it's only in the first 20 years that you go to university, you go to school. I mean, how odd is that? And so I think there's a massive transition happening, and I think it's exciting to be involved in that discussion.
And you mentioned Yuval Harari. I mean, one of my favourite questions is to ask guests what their kind of favourite books or impactful books that they're reading at the moment. Are there any others that you would share with people, that have resonated with your thinking at the moment?
I was actually reflecting, because we're recording this at Christmas time, as to what my favourite book of the year has been. And it's nothing to do with tech, but it's a book written by a 9-year-old girl called Bana Al-Abed from Syria, who speaks about the plight of children in war zones. And I think it's akin to like a modern diary of Anne Frank. And I'd encourage everyone to read it, because I found it fascinating and I couldn't put it down. It's a short book. She's a 9-year-old girl, being so articulate and eloquent, I think gives you a different perspective on what life is like for children in parts of the world that are ravaged by war and conflict. And unfortunately, the times that we live in, there's a lot of them. And hopefully she will be coming to the Global Education and Skills Forum. Just
to round off, 2019, so you've got Tmrw Digital and the Institute, you've got the Next Billion Prize, and obviously the Global Education and Skills Forum. So, how does the year look like for you, and what kind of areas of EdTech are you looking forward to supporting and investing in as well?
Sure. So, without giving out too much commercially confident material, I would say to you that I've been trying to understand what the investing ecosystem is in a number of different places, whether it's South Asia, whether it's Europe, whether it's Latin America, or whether it's Africa. And one of the things that I've been trying to understand is the incubator and accelerator space in particular. So as an investing strategy, is that a good way to go forward? What I've been quite astonished with, actually, is in Europe, there really isn't much activity in that sector. You have a fantastic effort in Finland that I'm aware of. They have a fantastic incubator accelerator in France. And in London, I just don't think we're served well whatsoever. And so you think, okay, why is it that these kind of models don't necessarily last long, especially in the EdTech sector? And what is it that we need to apply to making sure that we strengthen this initiative? Because that, I think, will help galvanize an entire ecosystem by making sure that great EdTech startups have the support, the education, and the networks that they need to grow. And it's something that we're thinking of.
Very interesting. And I noticed that Bobby Kirshen was at your event. I wondered if you'd read her article.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. It's an interesting...
And she's been fantastic. Bobby's been very generous in terms of her time with us.
Yeah.
And she actually has done a mapping out of so many accelerators and incubators around the world. And we've been talking about, well, what do we do to support this kind of activity around the world, because I do think that the time has come where we should be thinking about how we support startups more effectively, rather than just think about putting money into them. Mm-hmm. I think we have a responsibility not just as a investor, but someone who's deeply rooted in education to do that.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think there's a lot of synergies actually of what you can do and how you can learn about these things. So the way that, for example, an Indian entrepreneur will approach their market is obviously going to be very different to how someone in Birmingham approaches theirs. But I think as entrepreneurs, they will have learned how to tackle challenges which are similar, which is how do you get into schools, how do you work with teachers, how do you think about efficacy. And I think having these different perspectives only strengthens knowledge and understanding, which in the end is good for the sector as a whole. So I think that's why this cross-cultural and cross-country kind of approach, I think, would be fascinating to have. One of the other things that I've seen is when you speak to an entrepreneur or a VC, they're focused on, have you grown by 3x or 5x or 10x? That is the jargon and the language and the patter of discussion. And actually, when I get asked in terms of as an investor, what is it that I'm targeting? I said, well, that 3x, 5x, 10x is fine, and it's important to keep an eye on that. But actually, the huge opportunity that we have is in improving the standards of learning for children everywhere. And that is what actually excites Tmrw Digital more than just the financial return that you can make. And I think it's really important for people like us to actually be vocal about that, because that is a responsibility that we have as responsible educators and investors.
I mean, and do you feel that as part of what you just said, that this idea of who is an educator? Obviously, there's an educator in the sense of a deep pedagogical understanding and training, but there's also this idea that we are all responsible for our children's learning and upbringing, and supporting the next generation, and that does involve a lot of different players, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and education is a serious responsibility that we have to take on a footing that we haven't previously done. I mean, look at all the challenges that this world faces. And, I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals at the beginning, where there are 17. Actually, we don't believe you need 17, you just need one, which is education. If you achieve that, then you'll achieve so many other things. And that's why we implore government, we implore investors, we implore startups to think about this from a responsibility that we have towards our future generations. It's fine to want to make money, and I think it's a good thing that you build sustainable businesses. But in the end, you have to have at the core of what you do, the needs of the student and the learner to make sure that they're doing much better than they could have.
So in terms of the next billion prize, where are you with the planning for this, or for 2019?
Thank you for asking the question. We've just opened the applications process online on our website. And if you're an edtech startup, which is pre-Series A, that is looking at how your product or service actually applies to bringing the next billion learners online, then please do come on board and make sure you fill in the application form, and our team will come back to you. I'd like to encourage you all to come and visit and participate. The winner of this year's prize is a lady called Mursal, who runs a company called Chatterbox. As a result of participating in our conference, she's had follow-on funding, she's had a surge of customers, and the profile that she's gained from whether it's a BBC news website, the Times Education Supplement, or any of these standard bearers when it comes to the media has been transformational for her. And for that reason, I would say to you that there's a great benefit in coming, and not just in participating in the prize, but actually taking part in the process and the event.
Well, that is a great way to end today's podcast episode. So thank you so much for your time.
Wishing you all a Merry Christmas.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.